Milwaukee looked ordinary from the outside, but behind one quiet door, something far darker was taking shape. For years, a hidden pattern of missing men, strange smells, and unanswered questions stayed buried in the shadows. Then one escaped victim changed everything, and the truth began to crack open. What police found next was not just a crime scene, but a nightmare built piece by piece. This is the story of a man who turned secrecy into a weapon and left behind a trail that still chills people. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into the first twisted chapter tonight. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At first, nothing about his early life stood out, but inside his home, things were already unstable. His father was off and away, and his mother struggled with depression and constant tension. Dahmer later said he felt unsure of the solidity of the family, growing up around arguments and emotional distance. As a child, he changed after a surgery at a young age, becoming more withdrawn and quiet. In school, he was seen as shy and isolated with only a few friends. But what stood out most was something far more unusual. Around the age of 4, he became fascinated with animal bones after watching his father clean them. That moment stayed with him. Over time, this curiosity grew stronger. He began collecting dead animals, sometimes from the roadside, and taking them apart to understand how they fit together. He preserved bones in jars and even learned how to bleach them. By his early teens, this was no longer just curiosity, and it had become a private world he controlled. Away from everyone else, what looked like harmless interest was slowly turning into something darker, and as he entered his teenage years, those quiet habits began to mix with thoughts he could no longer control. As Jeffrey Dahmer moved deeper into his teenage years, his behavior started shifting in ways people around him didn't fully understand. By the age of 14, he was already drinking heavily, sometimes even during school hours, and later describing alcohol as my medicine. On the surface, he gained attention as a class clown, performing strange acts that classmates called doing a Dahmer. During this time, Dahmer also began to struggle with his identity. He started to keep some things completely secret, and at the same time, his thoughts became more focused on control and isolation rather than being in company. He later admitted that he imagined situations where he could have complete control over another person. Around the age of 16, one of those thoughts almost turned into action. He hid near a road with a baseball bat, waiting for a jogger he had noticed before. The moment never came, but the intention marked a serious shift. At the same time, his life at home was breaking down. His parents' marriage collapsed, and by 1978, they were separating. And just weeks after graduation, with no one around to notice, everything changed in a single moment. In June 1978, just weeks after finishing high school, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. On June 18th, he picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Dahmer offered him a ride and promised a few beers, bringing him back to an empty house. They spent hours talking and drinking, but when Hicks decided he wanted to leave, Dahmer later admitted he wanted to leave and I didn't want him to leave. In that moment, everything shifted. He struck Hicks from behind and then ended his life shortly after. What followed showed a level of planning that went far beyond panic. Dahmer moved the body to the basement, later taking it apart and burying the remains in his yard. Weeks later, he returned, removing the remains again, breaking them down further, and scattering them in the woods behind his home. For nearly 9 years, there were no known killings. On the outside, it looked like a one-time act. He went to college, joined the army in 1979, and later returned home after being discharged in 1981 due to alcohol issues. For almost a decade, it seemed like the darkness had stopped, but it was only waiting to come back stronger. In November 1987, after nearly 9 years without a known killing, Jeffrey Dahmer returned to something far darker, and this time, it didn't stop. He met 25-year-old Tuomi and brought him to a hotel room. The next morning, Dahmer woke up to a scene he claimed he didn't fully remember, later saying he could not believe this had happened. But what mattered was what came next. This moment became a turning point. From here on, his actions followed a clear and repeated pattern. He began seeking out victims, usually meeting them in bars and convincing them to come back with him. Once there, he would use sedatives to make them unconscious before ending their lives. Most of the victims were dealt with in this same way, but it didn't stop there. After the killings, Dahmer began keeping parts of the bodies, he later admitted. I trained myself to view people as objects of pleasure instead of as people. That shift changed everything. What started as an act became a routine, and the routine became an obsession. Between 1987 and 1991, he would go on to kill 16 more victims. And as the pattern grew stronger, so did his confidence, leading him to take even bigger risks right under people's noses. After 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer's actions became more frequent, and much of this phase unfolded while he was still living with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. He continued using the same method, luring victims with money or promises, then drugging them before taking their lives. The routine was becoming steady, planned, and increasingly dangerous. In early 1988, he targeted a 14-year-old boy, James Dockstader, and later a 22-year-old man, Richard Guerrero. Both were brought back to his grandmother's house where the same pattern was followed. Over time, he began acting more confidently, repeating the process without hesitation. But there were warning signs. On one occasion in April 1988, a man named Ronald Flowers survived after being drugged. Dahmer didn't go through with killing him and instead left him at a bus stop. Flowers later woke up in a hospital with injuries, showing just how close the situation had come to being exposed. At the same time, Dahmer was already coming into contact with law enforcement. In 1986, he had been arrested for disorderly conduct, and in 1988, he faced more serious charges involving a minor. Despite this, he was released and placed on probation. Even inside his grandmother's home, strange smells and late-night activity raised concerns. And when he was finally forced to move out, he gained something far more dangerous: complete privacy. In May 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street. The rent was about $300 a month, and for the first time, he was completely alone. That privacy changed everything. Within just 1 week, he killed his sixth victim, a 32-year-old named Raymond Smith, after lacing his drink with 7 sleeping pills. Inside this apartment, his actions became more organized and more disturbing. He bought a Polaroid camera and began taking pictures of his victims at different stages. These images were later found by police and showed how carefully he documented everything. He also started using acid and chemicals to break down remains and preserve certain parts. Dahmer later explained his mindset, saying, "It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. I also wanted to keep, if I couldn't keep them there with me whole, I at least could keep their skeletons." This thinking showed how deeply his need for control had grown. During this time, he also began storing body parts in his apartment, keeping skulls and other remains hidden in different places. By 1990, the pattern was no longer hidden. It was fully established and happening again and again. And as time went on, his actions didn't just continue. They became even more extreme and unpredictable. By 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's behavior had entered its most troubling phase. He began trying to control his victims in ways he had not attempted before. In several cases, he carried out dangerous experiments, using chemicals like hydrochloric acid in an attempt to make them completely passive and unresponsive. These attempts never worked as he intended, but he continued repeating them. One of the most alarming moments came in May 1991, involving a 14-year-old boy named Konerak Sinthasomphone. After being drugged, the boy managed to get outside, where 3 women noticed something was wrong and called for help. When officers arrived, Dahmer convinced them that everything was fine, claiming the boy was his adult partner who had simply had too much to drink. Despite the women raising serious concerns, the situation was dismissed, and the boy was taken back to the apartment. Inside the building, neighbors had already reported strange odors and unusual noises several times. Dahmer gave simple explanations, blaming spoiled food or dead fish. At the same time, his actions were becoming faster and more frequent, showing a clear loss of control. And just when it seemed like nothing would stop him, one final encounter changed everything. On July 22nd, 1991, everything finally began to fall apart. Jeffrey Dahmer approached 3 men and offered money for photos and company. Only one agreed, a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards. Inside the apartment, Edwards quickly noticed something was wrong. There was a strong odor, strange items around the room, and Dahmer's behavior became tense and unpredictable. At one point, Dahmer placed a handcuff on Edwards and held a knife. Were you telling him he intended to take pictures? Edwards stayed calm, waiting for a moment to escape. When Dahmer lost focus, Edwards punched him and ran out of the apartment, still wearing the handcuff. At around 11:30 p.m., he stopped 2 officers and told them what had happened. When police returned to apartment 213, Dahmer tried to stay calm and cooperative. But once inside, everything changed. In the bedroom, officers found Polaroid photos showing victims in different stages. One officer said, "These are for real." Moments later, they discovered a severed head in the refrigerator. Dahmer quietly said, "For what I did, I should be dead." A full search revealed multiple skulls, human remains, and a total of 74 Polaroid images. And as the truth came out, the full scale of what he had done shocked an entire nation. Jeffrey Dahmer was later convicted of 16 murders and received multiple life sentences in 1992. He was killed in prison on November 28, 1994, at the age of 34. But even after his death, the deeper question never really left. How did someone live among people for years without raising alarms strong enough to stop it? And how many warning signs were missed along the way? What do you think? Could this have been stopped earlier? And which moment stands out to you the most? Make sure to like, subscribe to watch more real crime stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.